And you may be seated. Could you imagine a worship service that had a song like this in it? I mean, I don't know how you do the music to this, and if you had drums or guitar or a piano or whatever it is, how would you do this? How long, O Lord, will you forget me? Forever? Could you imagine? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemy say, I have prevailed over him, lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. I mean, when I read, and this is from Psalm 13, when I read something like that, it kind of reminds me, if I were to put it to music, and this is a songbook for Israel, it kind of reminds me of something that Phoebe on the Friends show, it's something she would sing, you know? Really negative and dark and weird, and that's kind of how I hear this, like kind of negative and dark, and Lord, where are you at? What's going on? Negative people are all around us. Would you agree? And negative people, I would say, they keep negativity as their anthem. It's that they had some bad things happen to them, and they carry that around wherever they go. Don't nudge the person next to you and look at somebody around you and says, you're the negative person, you better pay attention. Because I would say that we probably all have a little bit of negativity in our life, and some more than others. And generally speaking, if not always, it comes from a real source. It's that a negative person was bullied, abused, neglected. They were left out. And they carry that scar with them all the way through their life, and they're like, this is just me. I have this huge scar where I was bullied, I was abused, I was neglected, I was left out. They were robbed. They were robbed of a normal home when their parents got divorced. They were robbed of a good living when their partner stole their money. They were robbed of a relationship when tragedy struck their home. They were robbed of a nice place to live when their neighbor was just a pain in the neck. A negative person, listen to this, a negative person has unresolved pain that affects their outlook. A negative person it's unresolved, it's pain inside that's not resolved to go anywhere, and it affects their outlook on everything, on relationships, on their finances, on their neighborhood, on their workplace, on everything. And we're going to dive into that today. And here's what they look like. They look like a porcupine, right? That's a negative person. They're cute and cuddly on the inside, but you don't want to get near them because they have 30,000 little spikes that are going to come shooting out and hit you if you get too close or if you get them stirred the wrong kind of a way, right? How many of you know a negative person? Anybody? There's a few that don't know a negative person. You have not talked to enough people then. We all have negative people in our lives. And we all have seasons, I believe, of being negative as well. So in this message, we're going to see how to identify and deal with people like, I'm going to refer to, Negative Naomi. And we're going to start in the book of Ruth, if you want to turn there with me. And we're going to just dive into this book of Ruth. And if you're familiar with it, then you know where I'm heading with this. And if you're not familiar with it, then this is going to be brand new. But either way, I want to point out some things that I think will be helpful for us because we deal with the negative Nellies all the time, or negative Naomis, as we're calling them today. And what do you do with them? How do you handle this? What's God's way of dealing with this? Because as we're looking at life and looking at the series throughout the year, it's called Crushing It. How do you crush it when you feel crushed? And sometimes you are the negative person because you've been crushed by some negative things. And my goal is to help us to be others-focused in this part of the series. So in Ruth chapter 1, here's the background. I'd love for you to read the whole book of Ruth. It's only 4 chapters. It's a kind of an easy read, if you will. We won't do that this morning just for sake of time, but as I was preparing for this message, I read through this several times just to be able to gather a whole lot of information to be able to relay it to you. And so we're going to jump through several things and highlight some things as we look at this text. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. Here's the background. In the days when judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. So he's from Bethlehem, and it says, and his wife and his 2 sons. So he takes his family, his wife and 2 sons, and says, hey, listen, there's a famine here. We need to go to a place where there's some food. I need to prepare. It's kind of like I got laid off, and I don't have any work, so we're going to go to where there is some work, and we're going to go find this. So they go to this place called Moab. And the name of the man, verse 2, was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. So they go out, and they kind of make a new home in this place called Moab. Verse 3, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. So here he leads his family to this new town, and they get there, and it doesn't really give a specific time frame, but while they're there, he dies. And she, Naomi, was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, but both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So this woman, Naomi, is in this very difficult place, where she goes to Moab, and she's starting kind of a new life to be able to provide for a family with her husband, excited for this new opportunity that maybe awaits them as they get there. And as they do, during the course of time, her husband dies, which is tragic. And she's left with her 2 sons. Her 2 sons marry, and then she's like, okay, well, I'll make a life with them. And then her 2 sons died, and now she's only left with her daughters-in-law. So what do you do after losing everyone? In that culture, she would be judged negatively. Everyone would look and say, you should stay away from her, because Naomi probably is something's going on with the way God's treating her, and it would be a very negative kind of outlook that people would have on her, and she would have that on herself as well. And we're going to see that. So the next few verses, we see what she decides to do. She says, listen, to Orpah and to Ruth, she says to them, listen, you guys need to leave and go back to your own families, and you need to just start your life over. I'm going to go back to my hometown, to Bethlehem, and I'm just going to live out my days there. And she's basically now resigning herself to a new identity. It's a brand new identity for her. And she helps them to understand what that is. Verses 8 through verse 10, she says, but Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with me. She's a negative person. She turns into this, but she's still encouraging her daughters-in-law. So she's not a horrible person to be around, but she's a bit negative, and you're going to see that. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of your husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, no, we will return. And Naomi said, and this is so incredible what she's saying in verse 11. Don't miss this. She says this, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Here's the negative Naomi coming out. She's lost everything. And now she's pouring out the negativity toward them. And here's what she says. Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? And that's the tradition at that point, that they need to marry out of her family in a sense and carry that gene through. And she's basically saying, listen, I have no value. I have nothing to offer you. I am a nobody. My identity is I'm broken and I'm a castaway, and I don't want that to be part of your legacy. Instead, I want to just let you go do your thing, and so just move on away from me. Then you find And we'll come back to the rest of that part. But then you find when she gets to Bethlehem, here's what she says there, verse 19. So the two of them, and this is Ruth, goes with her, says the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. So she was known in the town. It was a small town. So she's known by them. She comes in. The whole town is stirred by them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And Naomi says back, and look at this. This is a huge perspective. She's kind of pushing back. Here's her new identity. She says, "Do not call me Naomi. That's how you knew me before. Don't call me Naomi. My new name is Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity against me," or upon me? Mara literally means bitter. Don't call me Naomi, call me the bitter one. Could you imagine that being your nickname now, or your name? And that's what she's saying. Listen, this is my new identity. I'm the bitter one that no one wants to be around. I'm just a nasty person, and God doesn't like me. God doesn't love me. He brought all of this upon me. And so because of that, listen, you don't want me around you either. You see, what happens is oftentimes you take negativity, a negative person, they take negativity upon them as their new identity when everything and everyone around you, you just kind of become negative to everyone. You have a victim mentality. Here's what happens with a negative person. They push people away. Anybody that comes near them, it's kind of like that porcupine. They push people away. Why? And here's what happens. They think they're doing everyone else a favor, and what they're doing is they're insulating you from them. And that's what Naomi is doing. I just want to insulate you from me. Listen, God even says I'm no good. I am not valuable in any part of life. I'm just here existing, and that's just what I'm going to do. I'm just going to exist over in a corner. Just leave me alone, and I'll just go about my merry way, and that's just where it's going to be. And here's what a negative person does then. They assume then that other people are going to reject them. They assume that other people are going to hurt them. They assume that they're going to be abandoned. They assume that they're going to be hurt. They assume all kinds of things into relationships as well. That's how a negative person works in the end. So in school, let me apply this. In school, you assumed that based on your past that you won't get the part, so you don't try hard, or you don't even apply to try to get the part that you want to get. In business, you're negative and you basically assume that you're not going to get the sale, so you just don't even try to get the sale, or you kind of throw it out there and say, well, you probably don't want to go with me, but here's what I have to offer. You kind of present a negative perspective and you insulate them from you. Meanwhile, inside you're like, I really need this sale, but they probably don't want me, so I'm just portraying myself in negative kind of ways. In marriage, you assume that they will do something negative, so you preempt that by pushing them away and viewing them negatively. You just assume, hey, this is not going to go well anyway, so I'm just going to push you away. You're out here, and we'll just have this platonic kind of relationship and stay in this kind of negative way. But we're avoiding pain by doing this, and I'm insulating you and the kids from all this negativity by doing this. In the church, we do this. In the church, we say, well, we're not going to grow. We're not going to reach people effectively. And so we did that before. We had Vacation Bible School, and we had this event and the other thing. We tried all kinds of things, and this person left because of that, and that one left because, and we have these negatives in the past. And so what we do is we stop trying. We stop praying. We stop pursuing our calling. We stop being the gift, and we just kind of exist until we kind of fade off into the sunset somewhere. Negatives are all over the place, aren't they? It's in every aspect of our life. So the question is, how do you deal with a negative Naomi? How do you deal with a negative Naomi? Because if we dive into this, and if I could sit with each and every one of you, as God did with me as I'm preparing this, I would imagine that every one of us has some negative things going on in our lives. And we treat people negatively without even knowing it in some ways. God's working on me there as well. So how do you deal with a negative person? How do you deal with negative Naomis in your life? Here's number one. I'll give you 3 things to deal with this properly. And this is in the whole book of Ruth. Number 1, distinguish a negative person from a toxic person. Distinguish a negative person from a toxic person. Do you realize a negative person and a toxic person are 2 different people? A negative person is simply, they interpret life through the pain that they've experienced. A negative person is sitting there in the pain and they don't know what to do with it. It's unresolved in their life and it's pain and they don't know what to do with it. And so they feel like because they're there, they feel like this misfit, or they feel like, you know what, I don't know what's going on, but I must have done something wrong and God doesn't like me and you shouldn't either, so let me insulate you from me. Toxic people, they have been hurt badly inside. They have the same pain. However, what they do is they take that pain and they try to hurt others badly. Maybe you've heard that phrase, hurt people, right? That's a toxic person. A toxic person is someone that says, yes, I'm in pain, and while I'm in pain, what I'm going to do is I'm going to dish that pain out into your life as well. You should feel that pain because I'm in pain. It's interesting with Naomi. And by the way, a toxic person, what should you do with a toxic person? That's a different message for another time. That's a whole new kind of a context to be able to deal with. And we're not dealing with toxic here with Naomi. Naomi was a negative person. Naomi was hurt deeply. Listen, let's be honest. If you lost your husband and your 2 kids, would that affect you emotionally? Yeah, I mean, we would be like crushed and struggling. And that's where Naomi is. Naomi's like, I'm just crushed, and I'm just telling you straight, this is where I'm at. And I went through life, and I was not expecting this. I did my best, and maybe we shouldn't have moved. And she's just struggling. She's negative that way. And so she looks, and she's like, I'm going to encourage my daughters-in-law, and I love them, but look, you got to just stay away because I'm going to mess up in your life as well. A negative person, they can encourage, but they sit in that pain and it's unresolved. So you distinguish a negative person from a toxic person. A toxic person, they're just out to hurt you. You deal with them a little bit differently, and you hold a toxic person, you hold kind of boundaries up with them because you know that they're just kind of on the attack to hurt and to hurt and to hurt you. Now, how do you distinguish that if that's you? How do you know if you are a toxic person versus a negative person? A negative person says, I feel pain. A toxic person says, I want you to feel my pain, so I'll put you in pain if I have to. And they do it sometimes, it's just subconsciously, or it's just a pattern that they have learned and a pattern that they do it with other people. If you are an unkind person to others, that's toxic. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we'll move from that. So distinguish a negative person from a toxic person. Negative person is very simple. They just have a lot of pain inside. What do you do with negative people? First, recognize them, identify them. Number 2, don't allow negatives to become your identity. How do you deal with a negative person? How do you do negativity yourself? Don't allow negatives to become your identity. Naomi, she took the negatives personally. She took it as, God's doing this to me, God's hurting me, God doesn't like me, God doesn't want me, so I don't know what I did, but I'm in this pain, and I'm just taking this personally, that God wanted this pain for me, and I did something wrong. I see this all the time, where we kind of sit in this pain, and we say, well, because this happened to me, it must mean that God doesn't like me. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, would refute that in Romans chapter 8, and he says, listen, what can separate me from the love of Christ? There's nothing, absolutely nothing that can separate me from the love of Christ. God loves us so much that he sent his one and only Son to pay for all of our sins so that we can have a relationship with him, and he's done everything possible to establish and keep a relationship with us, even though we've messed up quite a bit. Don't allow negatives to become your identity. Naomi, she simply became that. This is my negative life. This is what's hurt me. This is what I've gone through, and I just want you to call me out as that person. This is my new identity. Ruth. Do you realize Ruth had every reason to be negative, just like Naomi? What did Ruth lose? Her husband? Her father-in-law? Her brother-in-law? And in that time, being a single woman and being a single widow for both of them, from an economic standpoint, you're in a bad position. You basically went from having a good life to being a beggar for the rest of your life until someone kind of picks you up and you become vulnerable in every part of your life. Ruth had every reason to be negative like Naomi. But here's what she does in Ruth chapter 1, verse 15. As Orpah goes, and they both choose different paths, and I'm not going to say one is you can't do one or the other, you must do one or the other. They just chose different paths. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and said, okay, see ya, it was great to be around you, I love you, and I'm going to start my new life. Ruth, however, in verse 15 says, she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts from you. Could you imagine this statement? If you're the porcupine trying to push everybody away, just leave me alone. I don't deserve this relationship, and you guys are great and everything, and just leave me alone, and you're trying to stab them with your quills or whatever and get them to leave. And Ruth turns and says, look, I'm not going anywhere. Where you go is where I'm going. The God you worship is the God I'm going to worship. And I'm going to be with you till the day that you die. That's resolute. That's saying, I'm not going anywhere. Here's the reality. Ruth did not allow the negatives to become her identity. She refused to leave Naomi. She pushed past the negativity, and she stayed there with her. And sometimes we have negative people around us, and we don't know what to do with negative people so much because we see the porcupine quills and we see the rough outside, and they kind of push you away, and they're not toxic in that they're trying to kill you, but you see the guards up. And Ruth could see right through it, and she saw the guard up, and she's like, nah, not happening. I'm sticking with you. We're going to go through this life together. And I would say that loving negative people looks a lot like hugging a porcupine. It really does. It's like, oh, you look so cute. You know, the movie Elf, where he comes up and I forget what animal it was that he grabbed. What was it? A raccoon, yeah, he grabs a raccoon. Oh, you're so cute. And he gets bit or whatever by attack. And that's kind of the idea that you go to a negative person and you're like, oh, you're so cute and cuddly. And next thing you know, it's like, oh, you're not so cute. You're tough. And here's what Ruth identifies. She didn't allow negatives to become her identity. Instead, what she did was she became others-focused. She looked at Naomi and she said, here's what she needs. She needs someone that's going to stay there with her. And she's saying very, very clearly, listen, Naomi, if I die, I'd rather die right alongside of you. And if you die, I'm going to be right there with you. No matter what happens, here's where it's going to be. And Ruth looks right through her outside kind of porcupine-ish quills, and she looks right past it and says, no, this is what's going to happen. I'm staying with you. Negative people often need Ruths in their life, that they go and they put their arms around them in a very gentle and careful way, but they're committed to stay with them through the pain. It's that they're others focused. They get the attention off of themselves and the negativity that they've been through, the pain that they've been through. And what they're doing is they're saying, instead of me focusing in and making this negative my identity, I am now going to you and I'm going to be focused on you and taking care of you, and that becomes my mission. That's where we get to be others focused. Number 3. So number 1, distinguish the negative person from toxic person. Number 2, don't allow negatives to become your identity. And number 3, care for others as God cares for you. And that's exactly what Ruth was doing. She's caring for her as God has cared for her. Ruth cared for her. She looked for ways to take care of her. In chapter 2, and this is where you could read later on, here she goes out, and they get into Bethlehem, and they've got nothing. So what do you do when you have nothing? And you're a woman in that workplace where you don't have, it's not like women's lib where you, or women today where you can go and you can get jobs and things like that. We don't have that happened. That was, or they didn't have that as they do today. And so they can't just go get a job. And so what Ruth had to do was she had to beg for food. So she goes over into this field where the farmer did not get all of the crop, and she basically gleaned from that with other people that were begging. To the degree that it says in chapter 2, it talks about her discipline and diligence, that instead of just going and grabbing a little bit, she was there all day working from morning to night, and it says about her, she hardly even took a break. She just kept working and working and working. She diligently went to care for others. She collected enough food, not just for herself, but she was collecting enough to take care of Naomi as well. She's going beyond just herself. To care for others in the way that God cares for you means I'm going beyond what I need and going and helping you. She could have moved on and had less of a burden in her life by just ignoring that she was even friends or relatives with Naomi. But instead, she said, no, I'm going to care for her in the best way that I can. And then in chapter 3, it's fascinating that she has a great relationship. She doesn't get resentful because you don't see, it's really interesting, you don't see Naomi going out and getting food or doing anything. It's kind of like she's sitting in a rocking chair thinking about how bad she has it. She's negative Naomi. She's not helping herself. It's fascinating. So Ruth's helping and everything. She doesn't get bitter. She doesn't get resentful for all that she's doing. And she gets to chapter 3, and Ruth meets Boaz. Boaz is a potential future husband. And she finds this out, and there's a relative relation there, and so she finds out this is a future husband, and she goes back to Naomi, and she says, Naomi, what do I do with this? And Naomi gives her some advice, and here's what Ruth does. She listens. She listens. You see, as you care for others, you have to be careful that you don't get resentful in caring for others. Because sometimes you just say, well, they should be caring more for themselves. They should be doing more. And she didn't do that. She cared by listening to her. And then at the end of Ruth, in chapter 4, they end up, Boaz and Ruth end up getting married. And in chapter 4, verse 13, here's the kind of the end of the story. It says, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, and so the women come up to Naomi. You remember the bitter one that's sitting in the corner in the rocking chair, and don't bother me because I'm bitter? They come up to Naomi after she has a child, and they come up to her and say, blessed be the Lord. Here, let's look at what God's doing, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him up on her lap, and he became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed, who is the father of Jesse, the father of David. It's really fascinating. I mean, check this cool story out. The women come up to Naomi, and this is kind of a weird one, and historically I'm not sure if this totally works out or not, but they kind of came up to Naomi and said, hey, guess what? God loves you so much that he gave you a son. His name's Obed. Ruth's like, nah, it's my son. And Naomi's like, no, I'll take him. Okay, cool. And Naomi, you see what happens. She takes the child in like a grandmom does, right? And like she walks into the room, and everybody looks at grandmom, and what do you do with the baby? Okay, you can have her, right? Or him. And that's the thing we see. And the ladies say, we're naming him Obed. It's awesome because God gave you a son. Here's the neat thing about this. As you care for others the way God cares for you, remind yourself of God's faithfulness and remind others of God's faithfulness. Do you see what they're doing with her? This bitter woman that's sitting in a corner in a rocking chair that feels no value in life is sitting there just kind of wasting away, and I just hope I die someday soon. And they come up to her and they revisit this and say, look how faithful God is. He is redeeming all of the pain in your past, and he has a purpose for that. And here is this precious little son, and he's got a plan for the son. And by the way, this son, grandson, is guess who? The one we just talked about, David. How cool is that? Now we get to see that big picture. What did Naomi see? She saw negativity. She saw negativity. Did they convince her at that point in time to stop being so negative? Maybe. It doesn't really give us that. But it helps us to see into our life and say, okay, as we go through negative moments, what do we do with it? We can sit there in the rocking chair and just think about our negativity like Naomi does, or we can turn like Ruth and turn like the ladies that surrounded Ruth, and we can care for others and care for ourselves the way God cares for us. In that we remind ourselves of God's faithfulness. Our identity is not in our pain then. Our identity is in God's faithfulness. It's, yes, I'm going through this pain. However, God is so faithful that he has a plan for this, and he will redeem this in my life. So what does this look like? If you are a negative Nelly, if you're a negative Naomi, that you can relate to Naomi, and you're sitting there like, yeah, I'm kind of negative. I got this in my life, this negative. Maybe that's who you are. Here's my simple statement back. God is faithful to redeem your pain, right? God is faithful to redeem your pain. What's a practical step? Okay, that's great, Pastor. Great theological words. What do I do with that? Well, remember the psalm we started with, Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me? Here's my negatives. God's forgetting me. My enemies are coming up against me. I feel like God's left me. Verse 5, here's the end of this. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. It's that I remember what God has done, and I remind myself that God's not done yet. I get out of the negatives very simply by reminding myself of what God has done and reminding myself that God is not done yet. We see the truth in our pain too. We don't ignore it. Yes, I'm in pain. I lost so much. This was so valuable to me, and I lost it. But we realize that God has a way of redeeming that pain. As we are right here, what happens is we remove ourselves from becoming toxic. We have negatives that are still bombarding us, but we remove ourselves from being toxic toward others because we're focused in on, God, you've got a plan. I don't know what it is. It might be in a couple years, a couple months, a couple days. I don't know. But God, you've got a plan. So God, I'm just trusting in you for this. And you're not done. So it pushes us out of being toxic and enables us just to walk through it and to be cared for by people without pushing them away. Now, if you're dealing with a negative Naomi, how do you handle them? It's one thing if you are that. How do you handle someone that's a negative Naomi? You continue to distinguish a negative from a toxic person. You don't allow their negatives to become your reality, and you remind them that they're just negatives. That's not your identity. And you care for them the way God would want you to care for them. As a church, think about this. Do you realize we live in a negative world? Do you see that at all? Anybody watch the news lately? Anybody talk to anybody lately? Do you realize we live in a negative Naomi kind of a world? So church, how do we respond to this? Realize that God can change a negative and toxic person around. Did you do that with the Apostle Paul? Remember Saul, the one that wanted to kill people, the toxic person that was just out to kill, and now God turned his heart totally around to a person that was total blessing to people? Can God change people's hearts? Yes. So, trust God that he's got an outcome that is for his glory, for his purpose. He is a faithful God. He can change whoever he wants, whenever he wants. So we're just going to stay faithful to him. Don't make our negatives our identity. We live in this terrible world that this one's going off and this one's going off over here, and the church is and everything's bad and negative, and we have all these things that we kind of say in our mind, and I just say, stop, pause, hold on. Just because we live in a negative world doesn't mean that that's our identity here. What is our identity? For God so loves you and me so much that he sent his one and only Son to pay for my sins so that I can have a permanent relationship with him for all eternity. He is not finished with me. Yep, I have some pain in my life, and we all do. And I'm not going to ignore the pain or say it doesn't matter. It's there. It's real. But God's not done. He's going to redeem that for his glory and for his purpose. How? Why is God doing that? I don't know. But I know God's God. And so I remind myself of God's faithfulness in the past, and I push myself to be faithful to him as he goes forward. And then as a church, what we do together corporately is we lock our arms to care for people that are in pain. So we reach people in our church community here, and we reach people around our community. We reach our neighbors. How? We look at them and we say, I'd like to hug you, but I know you're like a porcupine. Right? You say, I get what it's like to feel like a porcupine, because sometimes I don't want you around me because I'm in pain. And we figure out a way through that barrier like Ruth did, and we care for them. Final statement. Porcupines don't make good pets or stuffed animals. Agreed? While we've all experienced negatives, let God redeem it instead of turning into a porcupine that pushes people away. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for all that you're doing in our life. Thank you that as we have negatives that happen in and around us, that, Lord, you are so faithful just to grow us through it, to give us the opportunities as a result of the pain, just as you did with Ruth. Lord, I pray that we wouldn't turn into porcupines, but Lord, we would care for people and we would stay faithful to you. Lord, I pray for those that just have gone through some significant pain, which probably is a lot of people here. Lord, I pray for your healing. I pray for your grace. I pray that you would give them the grace to walk out of that pain and use that for your honor and your glory. Help us, Lord, to be others focused as a church. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.